I was 11 years old when I saw my mother cry for the first time. It wasn't because of poverty. It wasn't because of the 3 years breaking land alone in Montana. Not because of her bleeding hands or the debts that wouldn't stop growing. She cried the morning she found the gold, October 1916. The earth opened during the night, a hole too deep to be natural, and inside, buried since 1749, there was metal that gleamed even covered in dirt, Spanish coins, hundreds of them, $400,000 hidden where Spain never set foot. Fortune that could save everything or destroy it. Because wealth doesn't arrive quietly for women alone. It comes with men, with guns, with court papers, with hungry eyes and questions that don't accept no for an answer. My mother held that first coin and whispered, "God help us." She knew she'd just found the most dangerous thing that exists, hope. And hope, in 1916, could kill you faster than winter. I remember Chicago the way you remember fever dreams. Blurry at the edges, too loud, smelling of coal smoke and standing water in summer heat. We lived in a building where 6 families shared 2 privies, and everyone's business leaked through walls thin as parchment. My father was a policeman, Patrick O'Sullivan, Irish like half the force, built like a man who'd grown up swinging hammers before he ever wore a badge. He brought home his pay every Friday without stopping at the tavern first, which made him better than most. He kissed my mother's cheek every morning before his shift. He taught my little brother James to count using his brass buttons. And on September 14th, 1908, he bled out on a sidewalk in front of a butcher shop, while a thief he'd tried to stop ran into an alley and disappeared into the city's 1,000 shadows. I was 5. James was 2, and my mother, Margaret O'Sullivan, became a widow at 24, with a pension that paid $15 a month when rent alone ate $12. She tried. God knows she tried. Took in sewing work that kept her bent over needle and thread until her eyes watered in lamplight. Did piecework for a shirtwaist factory, paid by the sleeve, never enough no matter how fast her hands moved. We moved 3 times in 4 years, each apartment smaller and dingrier than the last, chasing cheaper rent into neighborhoods where police widows didn't belong. I watched her grow thinner, watched her hands crack and bleed from work that never stopped, watched her smile disappear like something she'd misplaced and couldn't remember where she'd put it. By 1912, we were eating potatoes and lard more nights than not. James had a cough that wouldn't quit. I wore boots 2 sizes too small because new ones weren't possible, and used ones cost money we needed for coal. My mother's face had developed lines that made her look 40 instead of 28. And Chicago, the city that had swallowed my father and given us nothing back but a badge in a box and condolences that couldn't be spent, felt like it was crushing us slower every day. That's when she started reading the newspapers differently, not the society pages or the crimes, the back sections, the advertisements, the notices about land in the territories. Free land, they said, 160 acres to anyone willing to work it for 5 years. The Homestead Act, passed 50 years earlier but still active, still offering what felt like impossible promises to people desperate enough to believe them. Women could file claims in their own names. That part caught her attention like a hook. In Chicago, widows owned nothing, rented everything, depended on landlords who raised prices whenever they wanted, and bosses who paid starvation wages because they could. But in Montana, in Wyoming, in the Dakotas, a woman could file a claim just like a man, could prove it up, could own it outright after 5 years. Land that belonged to her, legally, with a title in her name that no one could take away. I remember the night she told me, January 1913. Snow piled against the windows and wind screaming through cracks we'd stuffed with newspaper. James asleep in the bed we all shared because heating 2 rooms was impossible. My mother sitting at the table with a map spread out, her finger tracing lines I couldn't read yet. "Catherine," she said. her voice quiet but different, harder. "How would you feel about leaving Chicago?" I was 9 years old. I knew leaving meant something big. Where would we go? "Montana. There's land there. Good land. We could have a farm, grow our own food. Own something real." I didn't understand what owning land meant. I just knew Chicago was cold, and we were always hungry, and my mother always looked tired. "Would we have enough to eat?" She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "We'd work for it. It wouldn't be easy, but yes, we'd have enough." That was a lie, though she didn't know it yet. Or maybe she did, and said it anyway because hope was all she had left to give me. She sold everything we owned that winter. Furniture to second-hand dealers who paid almost nothing because they knew desperation when they saw it. Her wedding ring to a pawnbroker who weighed it and offered half what it was worth. The few nice things she'd kept from before my father died, the china that had been her mother's, the silver candlesticks from her wedding. All of it went for whatever cash she could get. She'd saved my father's death benefit, $400 that had sat in a bank account untouched for 4 years, because spending it felt like losing him twice. Now she withdrew it all, added her sewing savings, counted it out on the table one night while James and I watched. $640. Everything we had in the world converted to bills and coins. Her family thought she'd lost her mind. My grandmother came to the apartment and begged her not to go. "You'll die out there, Margaret. You and the children both. You don't know farming. You don't know that life. What happens when winter comes and you're 40 miles from help?" My mother's face didn't change. "We're dying here, Ma. Just slower. At least out there we'll have a chance." A chance at what? Freezing, starving, being attacked by... At owning something. My mother's voice cut like scissors through cloth. At having land that's ours. At not paying rent to men who raise it whenever they feel like it. At not depending on factory work that'll cripple my hands before I'm 40. I'm going. You can help or you can judge, but I'm going. We left in April. Took a train west that cost $80 for the 3 of us. I'd never been on a train before. The noise terrified James. He cried for the first 6 hours until exhaustion knocked him unconscious in my mother's lap. I pressed my face to the window and watched Chicago disappear. The buildings getting smaller, then giving way to fields, then to emptiness that went on until I couldn't see the edges anymore. 3 days on that train, sleeping sitting up, eating bread and hard cheese my mother had packed because the dining car cost money we couldn't spare. Watching the landscape change from green to brown to something that didn't look like it could grow anything at all. Men stared at my mother. A woman alone with 2 children traveling west. Everyone knew what that meant. Widow or desperate or running from something. She kept her eyes down and her hand on our shoulders and didn't speak to anyone unless necessary. We got off in Miles City, Montana, May 2nd, 1913. I remember the date because my mother wrote it in her Bible. The train platform was dirt. The town was maybe 30 buildings, half of them false-fronted to look bigger than they were. The air smelled different, dry, empty. The sky was bigger than any sky had a right to be, like God had stretched it too thin and forgotten to hem the edges. My mother hired a wagon to take us to the land office in Circle. Cost $6. The driver was a man named Hewitt, who didn't ask questions and didn't talk much, which suited my mother fine. We rode for 2 days across land so flat and empty, it felt like the earth had been scraped clean of everything interesting. Grass and sage and nothing else. No trees, no hills, just rolling prairie that went to the horizon in every direction. Circle wasn't even a real town yet. A land office, a general store, a boarding house. Maybe 50 people total if you counted the homesteaders, scattered for 20 miles in every direction. The land office clerk was a man named Porter, who looked at my mother like she was a problem he didn't want to solve. "You're filing a claim yourself?" "Yes, sir." "You understand what that means? 5 years continuous residence, cultivation of the soil, improvements to the property. It's not easy for men, I can read, Mr. Porter. I know what the requirements are. I'd like to file my claim. He studied her, then shrugged. Your funeral. You got a location in mind, or you want recommendations? She didn't have a location, didn't know the territory, didn't know good land from bad, or where water ran, or which sections had been claimed already. Porter pulled out a surveyor's map and pointed to a section maybe 8 miles northeast of Circle. This one's available. Got a seasonal creek. Soil's decent if you can break it. Remote, but most of them are. My mother paid the $14 filing fee, signed papers that made her a homesteader, was given a receipt and a description that meant nothing to me then. Section 16, Township 21, North, Range 42 East, 160 acres that existed on paper, but that we hadn't seen yet. We hired another wagon, a homesteader named Collins, who was heading back out to his own claim, and agreed to drop us at ours for $3. We loaded our trunk and our bags and ourselves into the back of his wagon and rode out into emptiness. I remember the moment we arrived. Collins stopped the wagon and pointed. That's your section line. 160 acres from here to that ridge, north to that cut bank. Creek runs through the east side usually. Sometimes dries up in August. There was nothing there. No house, no barn, no fence, not even a pile of stones to mark that humans had ever stood on this spot before. Just grass moving in wind that never stopped and sky that pressed down like weight. My mother climbed down from the wagon, stood looking at land that was legally hers, but felt like the surface of the moon. James started crying. He was 6 years old, and he wanted to go home, except we didn't have a home anymore. This was it. This grass and this wind and this impossible empty space. Collins unloaded our things, tipped his hat. Good luck, ma'am. You'll need it. Then he drove away, and we were alone. I watched my mother's face, watched her look at the emptiness we traded everything to own, watched her hands clench and unclench at her sides, and for just a second, I saw something that scared me worse than the emptiness. I saw doubt. I saw her wondering if my grandmother had been right, if we'd die out here, if this had been the worst mistake of her life. Then she breathed in deep, squared her shoulders, turned to look at James and me with a face that had decided something. All right, she said. Let's get started. We survived the first 3 years the way animals survive. Instinct, stubbornness. Refusal to admit that dying was an option, even when everything pointed that direction. My mother built a cabin with lumber she bought on credit from the sawmill in Circle, 12 feet by 16. 1 room, a loft where James and I slept on straw ticks that rustled every time we moved. She hired a carpenter named Dugan for 3 days to help raise the frame and show her how to notch logs properly. After that, she worked alone. I watched her hands blister and bleed, watched her lift beams that seemed too heavy for any woman, watched her refuse to stop even when her arms shook from exhaustion. She broke 20 acres that first summer, bought a plow and 2 draft horses on credit from the territorial bank at interest rates that made the banker smile. Learned to walk behind those horses from dawn until dark, turning prairie sod that had never been touched, breaking ground so hard it jarred her bones with every step. A German homesteader named Klaus Weber, who lived 6 miles west, took pity on her ignorance and spent 4 days teaching her how to plow straight, how to manage the horses, how to read soil and weather. He was a widower with a son named Johann. His wife had died in childbirth shortly after they'd arrived in Montana. He understood what it meant to raise children alone in a place that didn't care if you lived or died. Klaus became the closest thing to a neighbor we had. He'd ride over every few weeks to check on us, bring surplus vegetables from his garden, help repair things my mother couldn't fix alone. His son Johann was my age. We became friends the way frontier children did, grateful for any companionship that wasn't adults or silence. My mother planted wheat, scattered seed by hand in furrows she'd plowed herself, prayed it would grow despite her having no idea what she was doing. She bought chickens. A milk cow from Klaus at a price I later understood was far below market value, his way of helping without making it charity. She planted a garden near the cabin, hauled water from the creek in buckets that left her shoulders screaming, cut hay for winter fodder with a scythe that blistered her palms even through gloves. And she went into debt, $300 by the end of the first year. Money borrowed for supplies and seed and equipment, and 1,000 things you need to survive that cost more than hope can cover. The debt grew the second year, even as she worked harder, grew again the third year despite a better harvest. We were surviving but drowning, making progress but falling behind. The math didn't work and we all knew it even if nobody said it out loud. I was 9, then 10, then 11. James grew from 6 to 9. We learned to gather eggs and milk the cow and carry water and do the 1,000 small tasks that kept us alive. We learned that frontier childhood meant work, not play. That complaint was useless, that our mother was doing something impossible, and we either helped or we all failed together. Klaus proposed to my mother twice in those 3 years, once in 1914, again in early 1916. Both times he framed it practically. Combining homesteads would create a larger operation. 2 adults could manage better than 1. The children would benefit from a real family. Every argument was rational and made sense, and my mother refused both times. Not because she disliked Klaus. She respected him, maybe even cared for him. But accepting felt like admitting she couldn't do it alone, like proving everyone in Chicago right, like surrendering the independence she'd suffered 3 years to build. I wanted her to say yes. I liked Klaus. I loved Johann like the brother I wished James could be, James being too young yet for real companionship. I wanted a father again, even one who spoke English with a heavy German accent and didn't know how to braid hair. But my mother had decided something about herself when she left Chicago. Had decided she would succeed on her own terms or not at all. Pride, maybe, or something deeper. Something about proving that women didn't need rescuing, even when rescue was standing right there offering help. October 15th, 1916. I remember the date because it's carved into my memory like names on gravestones. I was 11. James was 8. We'd survived 3 full years. Had 1 more winter to get through, then spring planting, then 1 more year after that, and the homestead would be ours legally. Title in my mother's name, property she owned. The finish line was visible, even if still far. That night I went to bed in the loft, listening to wind that never stopped and my brother's breathing beside me. The cabin smelled like smoke and lye soap and the dry grass, smell that got into everything no matter how much you swept. My mother was already asleep in her bed below. She'd been working since before dawn, plowing, harvesting late wheat, fixing fence. The work never ended and neither did her exhaustion. I don't know what time it happened. Late. The middle of that deep darkness that comes in October when the days are getting short and the nights feel like they're swallowing the world. I was dreaming about Chicago, about streets I could barely remember when the sound hit, not loud at first, a rumble, deep, like thunder, but not thunder because it came from below instead of above. The cabin shook, not violently, just enough to wake me, enough to rattle the cups hanging on their hooks. I opened my eyes in darkness and felt the floor trembling under my straw tick. Then it got worse. The rumble became a roar. The whole cabin jerked like a dog shaking off water. James screamed. I heard things falling downstairs crashing, my mother shouting something I couldn't understand. The roar grew until it filled everything, vibrated in my chest, in my teeth, in my bones. I thought the world was ending. Thought God had finally decided Montana wasn't worth keeping and was crumpling it like failed paper. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, maybe a year. Time stopped meaning anything. Then silence. Sudden and complete, except for James sobbing and my mother calling our names. "Catherine! James, are you hurt?" I climbed down the loft ladder on shaking legs. My mother had lit a lamp. Her face was white, her hair loose from the braids she slept in. The cabin was chaos. Dishes shattered on the floor, the water bucket tipped over, one of the shelves torn from the wall. What was that? James was crying so hard he could barely speak. What was that, Mama? I don't know. My mother pulled him close, looked at me. Earthquake, maybe. Or... She trailed off because she didn't know either. Stay here, both of you. I'm going to check outside. She opened the door, stood in the doorway looking out at darkness. I came up beside her. The night was perfectly still now. Stars everywhere. No clouds. No storm. Nothing to explain what had just tried to shake our cabin apart. Maybe it's over, my mother said quietly, more to herself than to us. Whatever it was. We went back to bed. James curled against me in the loft, still hiccuping from crying. My mother downstairs cleaning up broken dishes by lamplight because she couldn't sleep anyway. I lay awake, listening to wind and waiting for the world to shake again. It didn't. But something had changed. I could feel it. The air felt different, tighter, like the moment before lightning strikes. When dawn came, my mother went out to check the property. Routine. She did it every morning before starting chores. I watched her walk toward the wheat field, her shawl wrapped tight against October cold. I was getting dressed in the loft when I heard her shout. Not a scream, a shout, shock, disbelief, something that made James and me both run outside in our nightclothes. She was standing at the edge of the wheat field, just standing there, not moving, staring at something we couldn't see yet from the cabin. We ran toward her. The grass was wet with dew that soaked through my bare feet. The cold bit, but I didn't care. Then I saw it. A hole. Massive. Perfectly round. Where wheat should have been there was nothing but darkness. The earth had opened like a mouth and swallowed a piece of our field. I stopped running. James grabbed my hand so hard it hurt. My mother turned to look at us. Her face was blank, confused, like she was trying to solve a problem that didn't make sense. "Stay back from the edge," she said, her voice strange, flat. "It might not be stable." We crept forward carefully. The hole was maybe 30 feet across. The edges were fractured, earth pushed up in rings like frozen waves. You could see layers of soil and rock and things that had been buried before humans ever walked here. And at the bottom, 20 feet down, maybe more, something caught the early light and threw it back. Metal. I could see metal. "What is it?" I whispered. My mother shook her head slowly. "I don't know." But she was lying. I could hear it in her voice. She knew, or was starting to suspect. And whatever she was thinking scared her more than the hole itself. Klaus arrived an hour later. We'd sent James running to his homestead with a message. Klaus came at full gallop, his horse lathered from hard riding. He thought we were hurt. Thought the earthquake or whatever it had been had collapsed the cabin or worse. My mother showed him the crater, walked him to the edge and pointed down at the metal gleaming at the bottom. Klaus stared for a long time, then looked at my mother with an expression I'd never seen before. "Margaret," he said slowly, "I think you need to go down there." My mother went down into that crater with a rope tied around her waist, and Klaus holding the other end from above. I wanted to go with her. She said no. Said if the walls collapsed, she wasn't taking her daughter down with her. So I stood at the edge with James and watched her descend into darkness that smelled like old earth and metal and things that shouldn't exist. She was down there maybe 10 minutes. I counted every second, heard her moving around, heard the sound of metal scraping against rock, then silence, long silence. So long I thought something had happened. Then her voice floated up, strange and hollow from the depth. "Klaus, pull me up." He hauled on the rope. She climbed using footholds in the fractured wall, dirt falling around her in small cascades. When she reached the top, she was holding something, a box, metal, maybe 2 feet long, badly corroded, heavy enough that Klaus had to help her lift it the last few feet. She set it down on the grass away from the crater edge. Her hands were shaking, not from exertion, from something else. "There are 11 more down there," she said. "Maybe more buried deeper. I couldn't see everything." Klaus knelt beside the box, tried to pry it open, but the corrosion had sealed it. He went to his horse and came back with a knife, worked the blade under the lid. The metal flaked away like rust-eaten leaves. The lid came free. Inside were coins, hundreds of them, stacked and loose and tumbled together. Gold coins, tarnished black and green, but unmistakably gold. Heavy, real. With markings I couldn't read, but Klaus could because he bent close and whispered something in German that sounded like a prayer. "Spanish," he said finally, looking up at my mother. "Colonial Spanish. Look at the dates. 1749, 1748. Margaret, this is treasure. Real treasure. Very old. Very valuable." My mother picked up one coin, turned it over in her fingers. Her face was white. "How much?" Her voice barely above a whisper. Klaus shook his head. "I don't know gold prices exactly, but this much, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more. You have found something extraordinary." I was 11 years old. I didn't understand what hundreds of thousands of dollars meant, didn't understand why my mother looked like she was going to be sick, didn't understand why finding treasure was making her hands shake instead of making her smile. "We need to get it out," Klaus said. "All of it, before anyone knows, before word spreads." They spent the entire day hauling those boxes up from the crater. 12 total. Different sizes, but all heavy with age and precious metal. They worked in silence mostly. Grim, focused, like they were defusing bombs instead of recovering treasure. They loaded everything into Klaus's wagon and took it to our cabin. Hid it under the floor in a space my mother had dug herself, covered it with boards and a rug, and pretended nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Klaus stayed that night, slept on the floor by the door with his rifle across his lap. I didn't understand why until my mother explained it in words careful enough for children, but honest enough to scare us. That treasure is ours legally. It was found on our land, but legal doesn't matter if someone decides to take it anyway. Once people know, they'll come. Treasure hunters, claim jumpers, men who think a woman alone can't defend what she found. So we have to be very careful how we tell anyone. We have to protect ourselves first. She went to Miles City 3 days later. Left me and James with Klaus and Johann. Took 2 gold coins wrapped in cloth and hidden in her coat. Found a lawyer named Brooks who specialized in mining claims and property law. Filed legal documents establishing her discovery. Created a public record that said Margaret O'Sullivan had found Spanish colonial treasure on her homestead claim and was asserting legal ownership under territorial law. The documents became public record on October 23, 1916. The newspaper ran the story on October 25th, and by October 27th, men started arriving. They came on horses and in wagons, set up camps on the edges of our property. A dozen at first, then 20, then 50, then more. Men from Miles City and Billings and places farther. Men who'd read the story and convinced themselves that if one cache existed, There must be others. That Spanish treasure didn't come in singles. That somewhere on or near our land there had to be more gold waiting to be found. They ignored our property lines, walked onto our land like it was public territory, dug holes in our fields, tore up ground, looking for more craters, more caches, more metal that would make them rich. My mother confronted them, told them they were trespassing. They laughed. A few apologized and left. Most just moved to different sections of our land and kept digging. Klaus moved in with us, brought Johann, and left his own homestead with minimal oversight because protecting us was more important. He stood guard during the day, fired warning shots over the heads of men who wouldn't leap when asked. At night he slept by the door with his rifle loaded, and my mother slept with her pistol under her pillow. And I lay in the loft listening to men's voices outside, rough laughter from the camps, the sound of shovels hitting dirt in darkness. I stopped sleeping well, started having nightmares about men breaking down our door, about hands reaching up from under the floorboards where the treasure was hidden, about my mother screaming and me being too small to help. James had it worse. He was 8. He started wetting the bed again, something he hadn't done since he was 5. Started crying at sudden noises, stopped playing, just sat quiet and watched the door like he expected monsters. The legal challenges came faster than my mother could respond. A man from California named Blackwood filed suit, claiming he'd been researching Spanish treasure in Montana for 15 years, and my mother had essentially stolen his discovery. A mining company filed papers arguing the treasure constituted mineral deposits, subject to mining law rather than treasure trove law, trying to establish rights to dig on our property. The federal government filed a claim saying discoveries on federal land belonged to the government until homesteaders proved up their claims, which we hadn't done yet. My mother hired guards, former soldiers who'd fought in Cuba and knew how to look dangerous. She paid them with gold coins sold privately to dealers in Miles City. The guards reduced the trespassing but changed everything about our home. Men with rifles patrolling our property, an atmosphere of threat instead of peace. Our cabin that had been poor but safe now felt like a fort under siege. I watched my mother age months in weeks, watched new lines appear on her face, watched her lose weight she couldn't afford to lose, watched her sit at the table late at night with papers and letters and legal documents she could barely understand, trying to fight battles she'd never trained for. Klaus proposed again in January, the 3rd time. He didn't frame it practically this time. He sat across from my mother in our cabin while James and I pretended to sleep in the loft and spoke quietly enough I had to strain to hear. I'm not asking because you need rescue, Margaret. You've proven you don't. I'm asking because I love you, because Johann loves Catherine and James, because we work well together, because combining our lives makes sense not just economically, but emotionally. The treasure doesn't matter to me. I would ask even if you had nothing. But practically, yes, combining our homesteads would help secure everything, would give the children stability, would give you partnership instead of fighting alone. Think about it not as surrender, but as choosing something good because you want it. I couldn't hear my mother's response, couldn't see her face. But I heard the silence, the long pause, the sound of her crying softly, then her voice, barely a whisper. I'm so tired, Klaus. I know. I thought finding the treasure would solve everything, but it's destroying us. Catherine has nightmares. James won't speak sometimes for hours. I have armed men living on my property and lawyers sending letters I can't afford to answer, and people looking at me like I'm either lucky or cursed, and I don't know which is worse. Then sell it. Sell the treasure and let it go. Another silence. Longer. If I sell it, my mother said slowly, all of this will have been for nothing. 3 years of hell to build independence, and then I just give it up because handling wealth is too hard? No. Klaus's voice was firm. 3 years proved you could survive anything. The treasure is separate. It's not about strength or independence anymore. It's about what's best for your children, what's best for you. And if selling it and marrying me means Catherine sleeps through the night again, then that's what's best. I don't know what my mother said after that. I fell asleep finally, exhausted from fear and listening. But when I woke the next morning, something had changed in her face. Some decision had been made. She called me and James down from the loft that afternoon, sat us at the table, looked at us with eyes that were red from crying but clear. I need to ask you something honest, and I need honest answers. Do you want to stay here, or do you want to leave? James answered first. I want to be safe. His voice so small. I don't like the bad men. I don't like being scared. My mother looked at me, waited. I thought about the treasure under our floor, about what it could buy. Education, opportunities, everything my mother wanted for us. But I also thought about nightmares, about James wetting the bed, about my mother's exhausted face. I want you to not be so tired, I said. I want us to be like we were before, when we were poor, but it was just us and it was quiet. My mother closed her eyes, nodded slowly. When she opened them again, there were tears, but also something like relief. All right, she said. Then we make changes. My mother married Klaus Weber on February 14th, 1917. Valentine's Day, though nobody called it that in Circle, Montana. The ceremony was held in a small church that served homesteaders scattered across 50 miles, presided over by a circuit preacher who visited once a month and married people, baptized babies, and buried the dead all in the same afternoon. I was 11, old enough to understand what marriage meant, but young enough to feel relief instead of complexity. James was 9 and smiled for the first time in months when Klaus said, we'd all live together now. Johann stood beside his father, looking solemn and proud, and afterward he whispered to me that we were real siblings now, legal ones, and nothing could change that. My mother wore a simple gray dress, no white. Widows didn't wear white to second marriages, and she wasn't the kind of woman who pretended otherwise. Klaus wore his best suit, brushed clean of prairie dust. They spoke their vows quietly, holding hands, looking at each other like two people who'd survived separate wars and found unexpected peace in the aftermath. But before the wedding, before any of that could happen, my mother had made harder decisions that changed everything about our future. In January, she'd met with Brooks, her lawyer in Miles City. She'd taken me with her that time, left James with Klaus and Johann because what she needed to discuss wasn't for 8-year-old ears. We sat in Brooks's office while he explained options in language stripped of comfort. Mrs. O'Sullivan, you have 3 choices. First, keep fighting. Defend every legal challenge. Hire more guards. Live under siege until you've won every case and can liquidate the treasure safely. That could take years, could cost tens of thousands in legal fees, could get you or your children killed if the wrong people decide violence is faster than litigation. Second, surrender the treasure to federal custody. Let them fight the legal battles. Accept whatever percentage they decide you deserve after years of court proceedings and government bureaucracy. You'd get something eventually. Maybe. Third, sell now, privately, to reputable dealers and museums who will pay below market value but will pay cash immediately. You'd take a loss, maybe 20% below full value, but you'd be done. You'd have money in the bank and the nightmare would end. My mother had sat very still, her hands folded in her lap. I watched her face, trying to read what she was thinking. If I sell now, how much would I actually get? Brooks consulted papers. Conservative estimate, $380,000, maybe $400 if we negotiate well. That's after my fees and after selling costs. $380,000. I couldn't imagine that much money. Couldn't picture what it looked like or weighed or meant in any practical sense. And if I keep fighting? Eventually, if you win every case, you'd get full value. Maybe $450,000. But that's only if you win everything. If you lose even one major challenge, you could end up with nothing. And in the meantime, you're spending money you don't have on lawyers and guards and risking your children's safety every day. My mother had looked at me then. Really looked at me. I saw her seeing the circles under my eyes from nightmares. Saw her seeing the way I flinched at sudden noises now. Saw her doing math that had nothing to do with money. Sell it, she'd said. All of it except a few coins for keepsakes. Whatever you can get from reputable buyers. I want this finished. Brooks had worked fast. Within 3 weeks, he'd arranged sales to museums in Chicago and San Francisco, to private collectors in New York, to dealers who specialized in colonial Spanish currency. The treasure left our cabin in locked boxes under armed guard, was shipped east on trains, while my mother signed papers that converted metal into bank deposits. By mid-February, the money was real. Numbers in account books at banks in Miles City and Billings. $385,000. More money than my mother could have earned in 10 lifetimes of sewing piecework in Chicago. But she didn't spend it like someone who'd won a lottery. She spent it like someone who'd survived a war and was trying to build fortifications against the next one. First, she paid every debt. The general store in Circle, the territorial bank, the feed supplier. Every person she owed even $1 received payment in full with interest. She wanted no obligations, no leverage anyone could use against her. Second, she set aside money for education. $20,000 in a separate account designated for me and James. For schools we'd attend eventually. For opportunities she'd never had. Third, she invested in the homestead in ways that transformed it from survival operation to genuine prosperity. She hired contractors to build a real house on the property. 2 stories, multiple bedrooms, indoor plumbing, the kind of house successful farmers owned, not desperate widows barely hanging on. She bought better equipment, improved irrigation, built proper structures, spent maybe $15,000 total, making the land worth significantly more than raw prairie. Then she did something that surprised everyone. Instead of abandoning the homestead or selling it, she rented it to a struggling family named the Parkers, who'd been trying to prove up their own claim and failing due to lack of resources. She charged minimal rent, more interested in having trustworthy people maintaining the property than in generating income she didn't need. Why keep it? I'd asked her one night, while we packed our things to move to Klaus's homestead after the wedding. Why not just sell it? She'd looked at me seriously. Because I want you to have it someday. Because I worked 3 years to earn that land, and I'm not giving it up just because we're not living there anymore. The Parkers will work it. I'll prove it up in 1918 when the 5 years are complete. And then it'll be yours and James's, real property, land that belongs to you with legal title. Nobody can take that away. Not poverty, not circumstance, not men who think women shouldn't own things. That land is yours. Remember that. We moved to Klaus's homestead in March. His cabin was bigger than ours had been, room for all of us without sleeping on top of each other. His land was well established, fields already broken and productive, structures already built and maintained. Combining his operation with my mother's money created something neither could have achieved alone, a genuine farm, a real future. The marriage worked in ways that surprised me. Not romantic in the way novels described romance, but solid, respectful, affectionate in quiet ways. Klaus and my mother complemented each other. She was fierce and stubborn. He was steady and patient. She pushed forward. He provided foundation. They worked the land together, raised us 4 children together. built something that felt like family instead of survival. The treasure money made everything easier, but it didn't define us. My mother invested it carefully, used it to create security rather than luxury. We ate better, dressed better, had things we needed without desperate calculation about cost. But we still worked, still did chores, still understood that comfort came from labor, not from gold that had exploded through a wheat field one October night. The men who'd camped on our property looking for treasure left gradually when they realized there was nothing more to find. The legal challenges resolved one by one. The federal government's claim was defeated in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, establishing precedent that homesteaders owned treasure discovered on their claims. The mining company's suit was dismissed. Blackwood's research claim was laughed out of territorial court. By summer of 1917, my mother's ownership was legally uncontestable. The gold was gone, but the victory was real. Klaus formally adopted me and James that summer. Papers filed in territorial court that made us Vebas legally. I kept my father's name in my memory but took Klaus's name in practice. He earned it, not through legal document, but through years of showing up, teaching, protecting, loving us the way fathers should. James stopped having nightmares by fall, started playing again, started being a child instead of a frightened animal waiting for threat. I watched him change back into someone I recognized and felt something in my chest unclench that had been tight since October. My mother changed too. The lines on her face didn't disappear, but they softened. She smiled more, laughed sometimes, still worked hard because that's who she was, but without the desperate edge that had defined her since Chicago. She'd proven what she needed to prove, had built what she needed to build, had survived poverty and wealth both, and come through with her character intact. On quiet evenings, I'd find her sitting on the porch watching the sunset turn the prairie gold. She'd have a cup of coffee and a look on her face that seemed peaceful, content in a way I'd never seen before. "Do you regret it?" I asked her once, meaning Chicago, meaning Montana, meaning all of it. She thought for a long time before answering. "I regret the cost. I regret that you and James had to live through fear. I regret that finding treasure brought violence instead of joy. But leaving Chicago, coming here, building something that's ours, no, I don't regret that. We own land now, real land. We have security. We have family. We have choices we never would have had in that city. The treasure made it easier, but it didn't make it possible. We made it possible by refusing to quit." She looked at me, smiled slightly. "You'll understand someday, when you're older, that the hardest thing about being free is that nobody can give it to you. You have to build it yourself. One impossible decision at a time." Klaus died in the winter of 1941. Heart failure. Quick and relatively merciful for a man who'd worked hard his entire life. He was 66. I was 36. Old enough to understand death, but young enough that losing him still felt like losing ground under my feet. My mother outlived him by 20 years. Died in 1961 at 77, peacefully in her sleep in the house Klaus had built, on land they'd worked together for decades. Her obituary in the Miles City newspaper mentioned both the homesteading and the treasure, treating them as equally important parts of her story. The writer understood what many didn't, that the gold had been fortune, but the homesteading had been character. I'm 76 now as I tell this story. Old enough that most of the people who knew my mother firsthand are gone. Old enough that Montana has changed so completely that homesteading feels like ancient history instead of something that happened within living memory. But some things about that time remain clear, sharper than yesterday, permanent. I remember poverty in Chicago with the clarity of trauma, the apartments that got smaller and dingier, the boots that didn't fit, the potatoes and lard, my mother's hands bleeding from piecework that never paid enough, the cold that seeped through walls we couldn't afford to heat properly. The knowledge, even at 9 years old, that we were drowning slowly and nobody was coming to save us. I remember the train west, James crying from exhaustion and fear, my mother's face pressed against the window, watching Chicago disappear, and the expression that said she was either saving us or killing us, but there was no going back now to find out which. I remember arriving at our homestead claim and seeing nothing. Emptiness so complete it felt like the end of the world. My mother standing in that grass, looking at land that was legally hers, but felt like the moon's surface. The moment I saw doubt crack through her determination, the terror that maybe my grandmother had been right, and we'd die out here. I remember 3 years of work that broke my mother down and rebuilt her harder, watching her hands transform from soft city hands to calloused farmers' hands that bled and healed and bled again, watching her learn to plow and plant and manage animals and do 1,000 things she'd never been taught because teaching cost money and she had to learn through failure instead. Watching her refuse to quit even when quitting would have been rational. I remember the night the earth opened, the sound that woke us, the terror of thinking God was tearing the world apart. Standing at the edge of that crater in my night clothes while dawn light caught on metal that shouldn't exist, watching my mother descend into darkness with a rope around her waist. The moment she climbed back up holding a box of Spanish gold, and I saw her face go white because she understood what I didn't yet, that finding treasure meant our quiet suffering was about to become loud chaos. I remember the men who came, the camps that grew around our property like infection, the sound of shovels at night, the rough voices, the laughter that didn't feel friendly, the way they looked at my mother like she was either prize or obstacle but never person. I remember fear becoming normal, sleep becoming difficult, my brother wetting the bed at 8 years old because his body couldn't hold what his mind was trying to process. I remember my mother crying the day she decided to sell the treasure, not because she wanted to keep it, but because selling felt like admitting she couldn't handle what she'd found, like proving that women couldn't defend what they discovered, like all the predictions had been right, and independence was too expensive to maintain when men decided they wanted what you had. But I also remember her face when she explained why she was selling, when she looked at James and me and chose our safety over her pride, when she decided that proving a point mattered less than her children sleeping through the night. That was strength, though I didn't understand it then, knowing when to fight and when to protect what mattered more than winning. I remember the wedding. My mother marrying Klaus not because she needed rescue, but because she chose partnership, because 3 years of proving she could survive alone had been enough, because independence meant having the freedom to choose connection, not the obligation to refuse it. I remember the years after, growing up on the combined homesteads with James and Johann as brothers, going to school with money for books and proper clothes instead of wearing cast-offs and pretending it didn't hurt, watching my mother relax gradually, watching the desperate edge leave her face, watching her laugh again, watching her sit on the porch in evenings drinking coffee and looking at land that was hers, and smiling slightly like she'd won a war nobody else knew had been fought. The treasure money paid for my education. Boarding school in Helena, college after that, teaching certificate, career as an educator that let me give other children opportunities I'd almost missed. The money paid for James's education too. He became an engineer, worked on dam projects across the West, raised his own children with advantages we'd never had. Johann took over the farming operation when Klaus died, married a homesteader's daughter from 20 miles east, raised 4 children on land his father and my mother had worked together. That farm still exists today, though it's been sold now to a corporation that manages thousands of acres. The cabin where we lived is gone, but the land remembers. The homestead where we found the treasure, the one my mother rented to the Parkers and later to others, I inherited when she died. kept it for another 30 years before selling to developers in the 1990s. The crater, where the Spanish gold had hidden for 160 years, is still visible if you know where to look, a slight depression in the land, marked informally by stones placed by people who wanted to remember the spot where something impossible had happened. People ask me sometimes if finding the treasure changed my mother, made her different, corrupted her the way sudden wealth is supposed to corrupt people. I tell them no. The treasure revealed her, showed what she was made of. She'd already proven herself through 3 years of brutal homesteading before the gold appeared. The wealth didn't define her. Her response to it did. She could have kept fighting, could have spent years in legal battles and hired armies of guards and transformed our farm into a fortress. Could have proven that she could defend what she found through force and legal maneuvering and sheer stubborn refusal to be moved. Some people would have called that strength. Instead, she sold it, converted metal into money, used the money to create security instead of display, invested in land and education and foundation, chose partnership with Klaus because it made sense and because she loved him, not because she needed rescue. Put her children's well-being above her pride. Some people might call that weakness. Those people would be wrong. The strongest thing my mother ever did wasn't surviving 3 years alone or finding treasure or winning legal battles. It was knowing the difference between independence and isolation, between strength and stubbornness, between proving a point and protecting what mattered. She taught me that freedom isn't about refusing help. It's about having the power to choose. That owning land matters because it gives you options, not because land itself is valuable. That wealth is only useful if it serves life instead of consuming it. I think about her sometimes when I look at my own grandchildren. They've grown up comfortable, never known real poverty, never had to choose between heating and eating, never understood what it means to owe money to people who can destroy you if you don't pay. They have opportunities that would have seemed like fantasy to the girl I was in Chicago. Education, travel, choices about their futures that aren't dictated by desperation. That came from Spanish gold that exploded through a wheat field in October 1916. But it also came from a woman who refused to let fortune destroy her the way poverty had tried to, who fought when fighting mattered and surrendered when protection mattered more, who built something real from nothing and then built something better from unexpected wealth. The treasure is long gone, scattered to museums and collections. The coins we kept as mementos are in a bank vault somewhere, insurance against emergencies that never came. The money has been invested and reinvested and divided among children and grandchildren until it's just numbers that create comfort without drama. But the land remains. The homestead my mother proved up in 1918 after 5 years of continuous residence. The title in her name that no one could challenge or take away. That land became mine and James's, became our children's, became foundation that poverty can't erode because it's real and documented and legal. That's what my mother fought for. Not gold, not treasure, not wealth that could disappear as quickly as it arrived. She fought for ownership, for security, for the right to stand on ground that belonged to her and say, "This is mine and you cannot take it." She got that. The treasure was accident. The homestead was choice. And in the end, choice mattered more. Have you ever had to choose between proving you were right and protecting what you loved? Between fighting for principle and surrendering for peace? Between independence that isolates and partnership that strengthens? Share your story in the comments. I want to know how you decided, because my mother faced that exact choice in February 1917 when she sold Spanish gold to buy safety for her children. And her choice taught me that sometimes the bravest thing isn't holding on, it's knowing when to let go.